Thanks. Yeah, you can actually check the court records where, yeah. So thanks for having me. This is also my first Tapestry, and oh my gosh. And I'm trying experimental software, which just isn't going to work today. So I'm just going to go like this. All right, so when Ben invited me, he said, we want to talk about failure factories. And I think one of the biggest things that we were talking about with my team, I work on a data team, which is kind of a group of programmers slash journalists slash reporters that are kind of embedded with our investigative team. So we work on the big heavy-hitting projects that our newspaper decides to take on. So, so we worked on failure factories. And failure factories was basically, came from a couple education reporters who basically got tired of seeing every year just a small cohort of schools. Every year when the state testing results came out, every year they just saw a group of 5 schools just get steadily worse and worse. Now these reporters had only been there about 3 or 4 years, and they saw that happen each year, and it was kind of a clear trend when finally in 2014, after that last testing round happened, they noticed like, oh, well, these are now officially the 5 worst schools in the state of Florida, which kind of raised some alarm bells. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our process and why we decided to launch it with a big kind of ambitious graphic project and some things that we learned along the way. So I'm going to bump back. So to my point, I'm going to give you guys advice, and I'm not going to follow it in any case for this entire talk, so I'm very sorry. All right, so making a point. I think this really came down to why we're doing this. Now, when we talk about failure factories, we know why we're doing this. In just 8 years, the Pinellas County School Board turned 5 schools that were doing pretty well into the worst in the state. And it came about after they abandoned integration plans, and they had just 5 schools in a small, poor black neighborhood. Then, when they did that, when they made that policy change, they broke promises of including more money, more resources, and just didn't change anything until we started kind of going like, hey, we need to look into this. So that's kind of like, that was the point. We wanted readers to know that this was a problem, that this was a huge problem, and that it needs, you should be mad about this. And that was kind of our true north. That was the compass that we went and used going through this entire process. So you will notice in this bit, we used very few numbers. We didn't talk about numbers. We didn't bog everything down with saying, and it decreased 25% and 30%. And that comes from a philosophy that if you can't see it, then it might not be worth saying. And I realize now, of course, using something with the y-axis with our poorest performing schools, only the front row can see it because of how this is done. So we worked on ways to kind of bring the problems with those particular schools to the forefront. These are the 10 worst performing schools in the state. Sorry, it's a GIF, so it's just going to loop. And those are our 5 schools. So we got to stay on target. We got to stay focused on where we're going. So one of those things is we went through lots of iterations going through this project. We tried a lot of things. I think the project actually, I pitched this graphic by showing the editors this, which never saw the light of day, thank God, until right now. Saying like, yeah, it'll be really cool. We're going to morph Pinellas. We're going to turn it into lines then, and it's going to be really cool. And everyone's like, whoa. Well, so as we were working through that storytelling process, we realized, well, this doesn't make any sense because this is drawing attention to a big dip in test scores this year, and it's impossible to see what's actually going on with Pinellas when you're trying to do this sort of stuff. We were really enamored with the technology that we kind of put together and then realized that, okay, this isn't working, so we killed it. And a much better way for us to just say this was 84% of black elementary school students in Pinellas are failing state exams. Almost every other county in the state does better. And that was just like a real simple way of just, here's the actual point that we're trying to make. Trying to get the flashiness aside and just moving right along. And so another thing, and this is something that I think is very rightfully a little controversial, is we avoided distractions. And there are two ways to cut that. One is distractions as far as developer time. We need to get this out and that sort of thing. But I think more of it actually came from, we don't want to distract the reader. And I think a lot of this was, eventually we just kind of came down and said, hey, we're trying to tell a story with this. And we're not trying to have something where someone can hover and look at those specific things. And that kind of comes back to the same idea of if you can't see it, you knowing a particular statistic isn't going to help you understand the problem if you can't really see it. And so it was that same sort of thing. We didn't use graphics that would need a tooltip. We didn't use graphics that would need some sort of exploratory, okay, well, let's look underneath and what's going on. And it really comes down to a story is not the same as a tool. There's a time for both, and when I made the slide, I was like, shoot, I should have just done story or tool, and that just should have been the talk, and which is much simpler. Because we want to make tools. I think a lot of us like making tools, and we kind of came around at the end of the project when we were done with the whole storytelling stuff, is like, let's make stuff for the community. One of the big problems that we had, that everyone that we were talking to about this story was saying, well, Pinellas School District has public school choice for like special magnet programs and something called fundamental schools, which are really prestigious public schools that you get in via a lottery. And everything about that was super opaque. No one had any idea, like in the ranking system, whether they had a chance of getting to the school whatsoever. And so while we were working on that story, we were like, okay, well, it's clear that there's some pretty clear need for that sort of thing. So we built a tool, not within the story, but before people would have to vote on the lottery, to say, okay, this is how I don't want to throw away my students' lottery ticket on something that they have a literal 0% chance of getting into the program, which ended up being the case, and they didn't say anything about that, which was fun. So there's a time for story, and there's a time for tools. But when we're on stories, to quote, I've actually never seen Glengarry Glen Ross, but I've seen this scene so many times, and I feel like the moral is like, he's definitely right and a good guy, and you should listen to him. But this idea, always be closing. So always be moving towards where you want the story to go. And the way that a lot of this is, again, in the same way that you sort of, we're doing slides right now. We're just going bit by bit, and we're unfolding as we kind of go along. And I think this is something that we really took to heart when we worked on this. You want to you don't want to show everything all at once. You don't want to show your entire hand. You want the reader to kind of get there as you kind of bring them along. So this is showing how, over time, the school district got more and more segregated, and some of the problems that arose when they started doing that. And so you want to kind of let the reader come along with the story and not know where it's going to end up immediately, I guess. All right, so yeah. And so focus on one point at a time, too. And I think that's part of the unfolding thing. The metaphor I like to use a lot is it's like a children's book. It's very simple, and you're showing one little point at a time, and then this, and then this. But it's always moving towards an end. It's moving towards a place that you want to eventually be. And for us, it was this. This is just one class of students at Melrose, which was, it's a school that was not more than a mile and a half, I think, from our newsroom. There, 154 out of this 160 kids were just, these are third graders, I believe, were just like not reading, basically. is what this sort of thing. And this was what this was all about. So this is almost where we ended this. This is where we dropped you off and said, okay, well, here's where these kids are today. All those things, all those decisions that we kind of walked you through, it all comes down to this point, which is about these kids. And the way that we launched the project was we did this a few days before we started running our big, something like a 10,000-word investigative series. And we wanted people to read it. We wanted them to be incensed, enraged, and to want to know what happened. And so this is where we left people. Who is responsible? And that's how we kind of built this graphic project all the way down to this particular point where the reader wants to know, okay, why did this happen? Who did this? I want to know more. And that is the end. All right. How are we on time?
Doing good, yeah. We have a few more minutes. So actually, we've got a little bit of time for questions here for Nathaniel, if anybody has a question about failure factories or what they learned on the project.
What changed as a result?
So there were things that we were able to pretty easily line out, like here are some simple policy decisions that you made by not giving proper funding, not having special behavioral specialists that other school districts were doing and weren't having the same kind of chronic failure in their schools. I mean, we're right close to Jacksonville, where there's a neighborhood called Little Baghdad, and that's a place where kids were passing at nearly twice the rate, and we wanted to know why. And they gave us like, well, we're on top of this. We're putting money into this. And the school district has kind of started to come around to that. So there have been specific policy decisions. There's incentives for teachers and that sort of thing, which I think is really going to be really important. But no, the school district hasn't started integrating that sort of stuff. It's a long road, I think, for a lot of these schools.
Hi, thanks. Love that piece. I wanted to ask you a little bit about one of the things that always bugs me about these data viz conferences, especially conferences about storytelling, is we never really define what storytelling means when it comes to presenting data.
Okay.
And so I think you touched on a lot of those about the reveal and about the progression through. So I just wonder if you might talk for a second about like how you view telling stories with data, no trademark infringement. I didn't use storytelling, right? So stories with data. So yeah.
Data stories. I think, well, one of the things I kind of like about what we were able to do here is, and again, this is just one sort of way, is you lose the graphics and you're still able to read it. You're still able to follow along. The visuals kind of enhance and make it a lot more visceral. But I think in a lot of ways, data storytelling isn't fundamentally different from any other form. It's just kind of a way of doing more with fewer words and that sort of thing, and being able to show things a little bit better than you can do just by telling it. But I think as far as like understanding how to do narrative and that sort of thing, that was the hardest part of this. The graphics took a lot of work and lots of JavaScripts, but figuring out, okay, how do we chain this along into something that feels continuous and flows? I think more of it is about editing and cutting things that are logically just kind of not fitting in so that it just feels seamless. And I think a lot of it does have to come down to a particular point. It's hard to do. I see a lot of data stories where they're going, where it's more about the data. These are the kind of things that we can see from the data and that sort of thing. And we see a lot of that, which are good, but those are more tools and explorations and that sort of things. And I think some of the more effective stories kind of shut all that other stuff out, and we're just zeroing in on this particular thing, why it's a problem, or why we're interested in it. It doesn't have to be investigative. It can be explanatory and that sort of thing. But it needs to come down. The most effective things I've seen are are coming down to one particular point, I think.
Yeah, we got time for about one more here. So actually, we'll do these two, and then we'll switch to the next speaker. So Steve.
I have a question about the chart that you had with the icons, a variation of the waffle chart, where you were showing that only 6 students were reading out of that. And what were the consideration? Were there discussions of, hey, should we just go with a bar chart with one really long bar and a short one? Because that has an emotional impact for me. I don't know others versus, gee, I can't do an accurate comparison, but I'm getting the gist of this.
Yeah, and I think if it wasn't so off kilter, it would be maybe more effective to kind of show how many people are passing, how many people aren't, with a bar chart and that sort of thing. But we knew, because it's 154 kids who are failing test standards, show that. And I would have loved to, we had another project where we interviewed 100 kids and asked them about their experience and kind of used their faces and mugs and that sort of thing. I don't love using little kid cutouts, basically. But yeah, when people saw it, they were like, wow, those are people. These are kids that we are letting down. And I think that's why we used it. A bar chart's going to be too kind of abstract. But you can still see the data in that particular sense, because it's so overwhelming. And we wouldn't have done that if it wasn't an overwhelming number,
Thanks for the talk. I really appreciate you reinforcing this idea of what I'm hearing of 1 point per image. And I see that doesn't, I agree with that fully. I don't see it happening in a lot of disciplines. Do you think that there's something about journalism with the nature of headlines and captioning and being pithy that makes it easier for you guys to do that? Or, alternately, are there particular challenges that you guys had getting down to that 1 point per image?
Yeah. That was something that we did have to kind of do when we realized we're trying to say 2 things with this. And there was kind of an aha moment when we were editing it and going like, okay, well, this is 2 slides then. We break it up, and these are 2 points that we're trying to make. But yeah, it all came, a lot of it is just the idea of a graph, of 1 paragraph, 1 line in the story is 1 idea. And that's something that we're kind of trained on for a long time. And it's very easy to lose sight of that very easy for me when I was working on this, because I was like, I want to do everything and that sort of thing. So yeah, it was kind of a really strong, very much came from an old grizzled news reporter saying like, you can't do that and that sort of thing. And it ended up working really well.
All right, great, thank you again. Let's give a round of applause for Nathaniel, Lash, everyone.
Thanks all.